In any deployment automation platform, you need a way to organize and define what you're deploying. Whether it's a web application, an API, a database, or a microservice, each component needs its own deployment configuration, process, and settings. And today, I want to explore projects in Octopus Deploy. In Octopus, a project represents a single unit of deployment, typically one application, service, or API, etc. Now, each project contains everything needed to deploy that component. It has a deployment process that defines how it gets deployed. There are runbooks for operational tasks. Variables handle common and environment-specific configuration. And there's a lifecycle that determines how those releases progress through the different environments you have. Each project has a single deployment process, which is one consistent workflow used across all the environments the software is being deployed to. Now, you do have flexibility to enable or disable specific steps in the process for certain environments, but it's the same process, ensuring what you tested in development is exactly what reaches production. Projects can also contain multiple runbooks for operational tasks like database backups or infrastructure maintenance. One key question to ask is, when should you create a project? Now, generally, our advice is that you create a project for each independently deployable component. So if you can deploy something on its own without requiring other components to be deployed at the same time, that's a candidate for its own project. However, if you've got tightly coupled components where changes made in one component impact another, those should typically be in a single project in Octopus. If components are stored in the same repository and they're built together, that's generally a pretty good indicator to deploy them together in a single project in Octopus. Creating separate projects for tightly coupled components often leads to some complex orchestration that needs to happen over the top, and that can become harder to maintain over time. Projects can be organized into project groups to keep related components together. For example, an online shop group might contain individual projects for the website, the API, and the database. This helps with dashboard organization and allows you to configure permissions at the group level rather than on individual projects. You can also customize project logos to make them easily identifiable. And yes, we support animated GIFs as well if you want to spice up your Octopus instance. Something important to be aware of, and you'll need to choose this when you create a new project, is that projects can be stored in two ways. In the Octopus database, which is the default, or as resources in a Git repository using our version control feature. When choosing a Git repository for your projects, your deployment process, runbooks, and non-sensitive variables are stored as text files in Git, giving you all the goodness of working with Git, like branching, pull requests, and the ability to edit the processes in your preferred text editor. This is pretty powerful for teams who want to version their deployment configuration alongside application code, and they want to review changes through pull requests, or test process changes in branches before merging them into main. I'll likely do a dedicated video in the series later specifically on version-controlled projects, so I won't get too deep here, but it's worth knowing that the option exists. To wrap up, projects are the fundamental building blocks of your deployment automation in Octopus. They're one of the first resources that you'll create in Octopus, and they're the boundary of the components that you're deploying in a deployment process. Getting your project structure right and knowing when to create separate projects versus deploying tightly coupled components together helps your Octopus instance scale, and it keeps your deployments manageable. More details and resources are down below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again soon.